just to let folks know again that we're going to be recording the training so that for folks that want to watch it again, they can, or if they weren't able to join. And we'll also be sending out the PDF of the PowerPoint for everyone that signed up. So if you didn't sign up through the Eventbrite, just feel free to DM us or put your email in the chat, and we can make sure to send that to you after today. Angel and Tatiana, do you think we should go ahead and get started, or do we want to wait a couple minutes?
Well, I'm ready. Angel and I were messaging that we're both ready. So, hello everyone. Welcome to Rise in Labor Day. This is obviously a community discussion, so we really like the input of the community and everyone here, and we're happy to have this conversation. So we're going to do an introduction and a little icebreaker, but first I'm going to tell you a little bit about the People's Safety Coalition. And if I talk a little too fast, just message me. I'll slow down. So the People's Safety Coalition is a group of various grassroots organizations, and the list will be after, that work toward the liberation of Black people, people of color, the poor and working class people, immigrants, people of faith, LGBTQ plus people, disabled people, and incarcerated people. So really like any marginalized community in our area, we really want to support. We were founded with a radical and decarceral framework to disrupt and dismantle white supremacy, racism, classism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, Islamophobia, and anti-Semitism through the lens of an abolitionist. Our projects include political education, community events, mutual aid, and City Council Watch, which you can check out on Instagram and on all social media, and on YouTube through Tampa Bay Activist Network. So we're going to start with roundtable intros. So name and pronouns, how did you hear about this event? And pick a number 1 through 15 for an icebreaker question. So my name's Tatiana Morales. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I heard about the event because obviously I love anything talking about labor's relation to the working class. And the number that I'm going to pick is 5. So let's pretend money was no obstacle. Where was the first place you traveled to and why? I guess this is going to be a little personal because I think it's just what's in my head. I was talking to one of my best friends that lives in Portland, and she's having like big relationship problems, and I wish I could be there right now to help her out. But I can't. If anyone wants to donate to that Venmo, and I'm joking. But we can go around, and whoever wants to pick up next, go on. We're excited to hear from you. And if you don't want to talk, you can write this in the chat and do anything you feel comfortable with.
Yeah, and you also can just choose not to participate at all if you don't want to do an icebreaker question. I'm Angel D'Angelo, pronouns he, him with Restorative Justice Coalition, and I will do icebreaker 4, what are some of my favorite scents? I love lavender, and the reason why is because lavender I associate with peace and sleep and tranquility. So I'm just obsessed with lavender. So if someone wants to just hop up next.
I can go. Hi, everyone. My name is Yordonos. I use she, her pronouns. And I'm going to pick number... Should I pick a random number, or am I supposed to be reading the questions to figure out which question I want to do?
Whichever.
I'll put number 13, my favorite season of the 4 seasons and why. I would say fall because I semi-experienced it when I lived up north for a couple of years and miss it being in Florida and want to experience that again. So hopefully I'll be able to do that next year.
I see some people put out in the chat. Awesome. If anyone just wants to unmute and introduce themselves, if not, we can just move on, no problem. Okay, not a worries. Feel free to jump in and introduce yourself at any point. Hello, Carla. Thanks for being here. Awesome. Yeah, Cuba. Hey, you're Deja.
So I'm just going to go over the presentation outlines. That way folks know what the outline of the presentation will look like. And so that way, as we're moving through the presentation, you can kind of get a sense of where we're at. We're hopefully going to try to stick to our 2-hour time because we want to make sure to respect everyone's time. And then we'll also have a discussion at the end. So first, we're going to come up with some discussion questions and probably break out into 2 different groups. With some pre-written questions. And then once we break out from those groups, we're going to come back to the main group and talk about our discussion and our answers. And then we're going to have a couple slides on different labor movements and specific labor activists that were throughout the country. And then we're going to go from the macro level more to a micro level, specifically on labor organizing in Florida, and some examples in Tampa as well. And then after that, we're going to have a couple slides on debunking labor myths, to get some more education on that, and as well as education on right to work. And then at the very end, we're going to have some post-discussion questions just to reflect on how the presentation went, what you learned. And then we also have some Tampa and St. Pete resources compiled at the end with some like social media handles for folks to follow, and the organizations that are involved in the People's Safety Coalition. And of course, if you ever want this as a reference, you can just email this PDF to you, so that way you can save it for reference and share it to anyone who's interested.
Okay, all right, awesome, sorry. So we have a couple breakout questions. We just wanted to see what folks in the audience thought about these questions and have a little bit of a discussion. We're a little bit of a small group, so we wanted to ask the group, would you like to do this as just the group of 11 we are here, or would you like to go into smaller breakout groups and have more independent discussion on these questions?
I personally would like to hear everyone's opinion, so I'm good with the big group, but I'm open to whatever everyone wants.
Yeah, I think the big group is better.
Okay, yeah, we got some agreements there in the chat, so thank you, everybody. I feel like I missed something. Hold on one second.
So here, while D'Angelo gets that back up, I'm just going to read through the questions just so you can like start thinking about them so the screen comes back up. So the questions are, what do you know about Labor Day? What do you think about unions? What is right to work? What rights have we gained because of the organized labor union, the organized labor movement? And what are some negative things you've been told by your coworkers or managers? Or what have you heard in general if you've never had a job and encountered this kind of language?
Thank you, Tatiana. Before we start that, this is what I meant to go over. I don't know what, my computer just spazzed out there for a second. I do apologize. We do want to make this space the safest space as possible. It is a designated learning space. There's no such thing as 100% safe space, but we all have a duty to make the space as safe as possible for all participants. So these are some community norms and agreements that I'm going to ask everyone to make sure you consent to before proceeding. If not, then unfortunately the space will not be the best for you at this time. And then we can also find out if there are any agreements that we did not discuss that you feel should be included to make this space the safest and most accessible to you at this time. So we all will imperfectly, but with intention, honor the guiding principles of People's Safety Coalition. That includes that we will not tone police marginalized voices, but we will also not cancel, shame, or put down people for being wrong. We will own harms if we cause them, and we will commit to doing better. We will call in with love, respect, and transformation. We do acknowledge that all of us, some more than others, have layers of privileges, even when we have marginalized identities. We all have been indoctrinated into cis heteropatriarchal, misogynistic xenophobic, white supremacist views, and we will work together to grow together. This is a designated learning space, so disagreement, conflict, confusion, and uncertainty are natural aspects of this experience. So we say that to say, while we're working as a group, some people may not have what we think is the right idea, and the idea here is to learn. Does everyone find this to be agreeable, or anyone have any concerns or anything they want to add? Okay, sounds good. Was it showing my screen?
It's loading it right now.
Okay.
It's up and ready.
I didn't realize that wasn't on screen the whole time. I apologize, everyone.
I dropped it in the chat for everyone to be able to read it themselves.
Oh, thank you so much. All right, so I'm a spaz. All right, let's get started on this group discussion. So the idea is to engage the questions. Who kind of wants to throw in? What is something you know about any of these questions? Doesn't have to be in order.
We can start with, well, I'll just start with, what do I know about Labor Day? And so we weren't really taught about this like in elementary school, like why we have the day off. I feel like there's just not a lot of historical context on all of the different labor activists that contributed to the entire labor movement. Really, the only thing that I heard about growing up was just getting weekends and like a 40-hour work week that was, and like working conditions from factories and things like that. But there are so many different types of labor movements that are not taught about and not filtered, as well as labor activists that we'll talk about later.
Yeah, I was all those assumptions, like, they're the same, that I just literally never heard anything about it in school. I know whenever like talked about it, it was like, oh, you have a day off, cool. And that was something about Labor Day that I was like, oh, this isn't like a massive historical achievement that it recognizes like major landmark successes by collective bargaining and collective power. One of the biggest negative things sorry, I don't know if I'm jumping around, but like one of the biggest negative things that I've been told by a coworker or manager was that like unions are for the managers, which I think is one of the craziest things I've ever heard. But that was something that I'd been told more than once at multiple jobs, and it was really interesting because it was like how the misinformation spread and how they talked about like the labor and the ideal of like, oh yeah, collective powers for managers, which doesn't make sense. But that's kind of an example of like one of the things I was told about labor that really kind of obscured my vision and understanding of what labor and Labor Day means.
Yeah, and everyone feel free to unmute or just type in the chat any thoughts you have on these questions. For me, I worked for a company for 9 years that had me convinced that we didn't need labor unions because we already had all these rights and our companies were going to protect us, and that labor unions just want to take your money. And these were campaigns from management. It was never in as direct words as I'm saying. It was always more subtle, but there was talk about unions. And I've only lived down here in the South, and we don't really have a good understanding of unions down here. So I was just opposed to unions for no reason. Like, I really was just willing to be a cog in the wheel for these employers and thinking that, oh, unions were going to hurt these billion-dollar companies. So, I mean, I'm not embarrassed to say that I was somebody that had those ideals because I've grown from that. And that makes it a little easier for me sometimes when I'm talking to coworkers and they're trashing unions. I mean, I was working at a job with people where we were making $9 an hour and we're lucky if we could get the healthcare program, and begging for 25 to 30 hours a week, talking about how bad unions are.
Right on. I'll just add a couple. This is Will, he, him. I share folks' beliefs. Coming up, I didn't really think about labor too deeply, but since training as a historian, especially a historian of working movements and policing in particular, I think about how Labor Day itself is born out of a moment of police violence against workers, right? We might get to this a little bit later, but how Labor Day started with Haymarket and a rebellion against police violence among workers in Chicago in 1886 or so. So yeah, I think about the deep seated history and how labor rights and demands for rights are connected to suppression and police violence as well.
Yeah, for me, I briefly remember learning about a little history of unions in high school in one of my history classes, but it did not obviously do it well. And I explicitly remember like there was no discussion of like what labor organizers and unions have done for us in terms of like the 5-day work week and the shorter working hours. It was just like those things just happened, not that like people like struggled actively and like lost their lives for these things. Yeah, and it's just so thinking about it going now, it's just like how do you skip that? Like how do you not focus in on that? And also I remember we spent a lot of time talking about like the Great Depression and like the horrid working conditions in the Great Depression, but yeah, again, it was like no tying the people who actually struggled for these ones to it.
Arius, did I say that right, Arius? I see your hand up.
Hey, yeah, it's actually Arius and you here. I wanted to comment on the Labor Day and the other questions. From my understanding, Labor Day, like I think Carla had said in the chat, is a holiday that was created in the United States to distract from the May Day celebration that Will was saying that started by the Haymarket Rebellion. And the question about the unions, about folks being differential or being against unions, or even some workers saying that unions are for the bosses. I think there's also like a discussion to be had about bourgeois unions and unions that are rank and file, controlled and directed. We have seen it. We see it in the South a lot, but we saw it also like after the Great Depression, where unions were working with bosses to suppress workers. In that, like they would negotiate strike clauses, or they would negotiate strikes out of contracts. So like the only weapon, or one of the biggest weapons the workers have stopping their own labor, were negotiated out by their unions. So like there's radical traditions like the unions that were that had communist socialists at their leadership. There was around late 1800s, early 1900s, and then there was the McCarthy era where communists and socialists were pushed out of unions, and where the unions became bourgeois and started to work with bosses to suppress workers. And I personally experienced that with a union that I had in the public sector. Right to work, from what I know, it's a double-think legislation, like double-think wording legislation in the South that basically allows you not to contribute to the union when the benefits that you have are because of the union that fought for you. So like, let's say, you know, the union negotiated a higher base pay, and then you get hired, you get that higher base pay, but then you're not required to pay dues immediately when you become employed by the employer. I think also for what rights have we gained because of the of organized labor movement, everything that has been gained, everything that we take for granted as workers, 8-hour workday, you know, OSHA laws, child labor laws, all that was because of people's movements. It's always been the case in every movement or in every law that apparently serves the people in the United States, that it's been people's movements who have changed and forced the government to create these laws. It's never been, the government has always had to be forced to the people's will. And I guess the last question works with the comment that I had about the second point, that I think workers do have a genuine concern or a genuine point in saying that there are bourgeois unions, there are unions that betray them. And also thinking about unions that may fight really hard for their rank and file, that don't remove strikes from their contracts, but that don't have a longer vision, right? Because it's not where workers get their labor value stolen is not at the point of negotiating your wage. Way before that, at the beginning, just not deciding overall how the value that you create, what happens with the value you create, that in there itself in the beginning is an injustice. And some unions don't see that, and they fail to serve their rank and file in that way and seeing the long-term goal of having full control of what they create, and they compromise and they fight to the death for a compromise that is just what the common term, which is a fair day's wage for a fair day's labor. So it's like you fight for a compromise rather than fighting for full control of what you create.
Thank you so much. That was a lot of history in that, and that's very much appreciated that you went over all that in such detail.
Yeah, I really appreciated everyone's like points. Like, Eris, you just spit. Like, you said amazing information, and especially about some things that we're gonna literally discuss. And I appreciate that dearly because that does show there are a lot of people that are interested and active that understand that there's misinformation, and also understand that like, oh, that misinformation has been blurred by like the actual history of people fighting for their rights. Oh, perfect. Well, you're both spitting. You're both saying amazing things. So no disrespect on anyone who's willing to speak out about the history of labor and why it's so important to discuss this like all the components of it and really to fight back for the rights of the working class.
And we're doing good on time. If anyone else wants to chime in a thought, something negative they've heard, or what right to work state means. All right, you think we should move to the next portion, or does anyone want to chime in? It's really up to everybody.
And you can always chime in the chat too, like throughout the whole presentation.
Right. Thank you. All right. Any objection to just moving to the next part? I don't see any, so we'll just go ahead and go forward with Yordonos.
Hi, folks. I just wanted to give a brief overview of different labor movements and activists in the US. So I feel like the labor movement was really put into the mainstream in the late 1800s and early 1900s. But I also wanted to include a couple sentences on just labor resistance that I didn't include as much in the slide, but wanted to put at the forefront on how enslaved people throughout the time period of slavery were able to be a part of labor resistance, whether that was destroying labor tools that they had to use on the farm or just purposefully going slower to decrease production. And I always thought that was really cool and never something that's really highlighted because it wasn't considered as an official movement, but are just everyday things that Black enslaved people did. And just wanted to make sure to mention that. And then in the next couple slides, I'll talk about a couple different labor activists and labor movements. Again, this isn't all labor activists, just a snippet because I wanted to make sure to respect everyone's time, but just wanted to educate folks on some new people that may not be aware of activists. So feel free to go to the next slide, Angel. So the first one I wanted to include was Lucy Parsons, who's one of my favorites labor unionists. And I think I recently learned about her in the last maybe 2 years. I don't think I've heard of her name before 2 years ago, but didn't really know that much about her. And I think Will was the one who said this about the Haymarket riot. And that's when she really started getting involved in the labor movement. There was a riot that was happening in, I think, early May 4th, 1886 in Chicago, where they were protesting for the 8-hour workday and better working conditions, and were met with a lot of police violence. And the police arrested, I think, 7 or 8 folks. And Albert, which was her husband at the time, was sentenced for execution because of the riot. And so she became a defender. She spoke at a lot of different rallies. And the Chicago Police Department actually called her that she was more dangerous than 1,000 rioters, which I personally think is a compliment. So she was really involved in political education and organizing the masses. And she was also against voting and was considered an anarchist. And I think that's a lot of people that don't really know about her, and was always interested in, can you go back to the previous slide? And then Will, I think, also put some more information in the chat if folks want to check that out. And we also included sources at the bottom of the slide. So if you ever want to know where we got that source from, you should be able just to copy and paste the link there.
1 second, sorry.
Okay, thanks. It's showing up back again. I do know that sometimes with Google Slides, whenever you're sharing your screen, if you press next, it's just really slow. So I'm not sure if that's why. But that was pretty much some of the bullet points I made for Lucy Parsons. And again, if you want to learn more about her, I put the links at the bottom if you wanted to check those out. And then also wanted to include Mother Jones, who was a famous labor activist in the late 1800s. She led a lot of different strikes, specifically with miners and also to abolish child labor. And a lot of the miners considered her as a mother, which is why they nicknamed her Mother Jones. And a fun fact that she didn't support the women's suffrage movement because she didn't believe in voting, and just because the women's suffrage movement really prioritized rich or upper middle class white women, and she didn't like the lack of the class analysis there. So I wanted to include her since she's one of the most famous labor organizers and one of the co-founders of the Industrial World Workers, or I think I got the acronym wrong, but it's IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World. And then I have a section on multiracial labor strikes. And so this is something I thought was really interesting and actually learned about in school. So this reminded me of the early 1900s when a lot of poor white working folk and also poor Black people were working together on different factories and were miners. And the coal miners actually wore red bandanas to signify the labor movement, which is one of the reasons why they're also called rednecks. And so they were able to organize together alongside the immigrant coal miners together to demand better working conditions and better pay rates. And so basically the state and the police saw this as a threat for all of these different racial groups coming together and just attack them. I don't remember what day it was, but it was during the 1912 to 1936 time period. And they were basically retaliating them by trying to separate them. So they gave the Black miners harder jobs, hoping that the Black miners would resent them and would break off coalition with the white miners. And so these were just some of the tactics that were used to separate any type of coalition building happening. I don't know if that was the original, but when I was learning in class, that's like one of the reasons. One of the reasons is because a lot of them work outside, like on the farms, and then their necks just get really red. But another reason is because they would wear red bandanas. And so that was, I don't know which one came first, but I know that I think that was part of the reason how like the term rednecks came up. But if anyone has like more information, please feel free to let me know and correct me. And so, of course, there definitely were problems during the coalition movement, as with any multiracial coalition movement. And so there was a lot of the white coal miners had to evaluate the racism that they had when they were building those coalition. But that was like one of the really good examples that I saw of multiracial labor organizing. And then there's some more examples happening on later on. And then this next section talks about labor movement and the civil rights movement. So there's a lot of overlap of civil rights activists that were also involved in the labor movement. And I just highlighted two of them, but there is also a lot more civil rights activists that were involved. So the two that I wrote about were Bayard Rustin and A. Philip Randolph. And A. Philip Randolph is actually from Jacksonville, which is where I'm from, and we have a high school named after him. Just a fun fact. So they were both socialists and leftists and supported and fought for racial and economic justice. And A. Philip Randolph was basically Bayard's mentor since he was older than him and really spearheaded how he became a socialist and how he became involved in the movement. So Bayard learned a lot from Randolph. And so Randolph was one of the first presidents of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, which was a labor union specifically for Black workers, and stated that it's the first victory for Black people to gain in the industrial complex. And he was also involved in the March on Washington in 1963, which Bayard was also involved in, although not given really that much formal credit. And we'll talk a little bit about why. So Bayard was also involved in the civil rights movement, and he worked a lot with Randolph, and he also joined the Congress of Racial Equality. Even though he wasn't given a specific leadership position, he was still considered an integral part of the organization and was also very much involved in any boycotts and freedom rides. Did want to note that he's really taken out of history because one of his socialist views, so people thought it was too radical, and two, because he also identified as a gay man. And so we really see how homophobia is used to erase all historical leaders. I don't think I learned about Bayard Rustin until like maybe my senior year of high school or maybe even college. And if it is, it's really just a footnote. And he also worked a lot with Martin Luther King Jr., but he wasn't given a lot of the credit that he deserves because of his identity. So this next slide I want to talk about was immigrant labor movement, specifically between the Latinx community and the Filipino community. So just wanted to talk about the mutual shared history that the Latinx community and the Filipino community share. A lot of them are populated in Southern California due to immigration, and also because they have a lot of commonalities due to Spanish colonization, where they get a lot of Spanish influence and culture. So there's a lot of pan-ethnicity between Filipinos and between the Latinx community, and with that shared culture. And another reason is because of that shared culture of the labor movement. And both communities are very heavily involved in spearheading the labor movement for immigrants, especially with farm immigrants. And so we talk about this in the next slide on different farm workers that led strikes throughout California. So wanted to talk about this strike that happened in the 1960s. I think that Dolores Huerta is probably one of the most famous farmer organizers, along with Cesar Chavez. But I didn't really learn about another organizer who is Filipino, Larry Itlong. And he worked a lot with Dolores and with Cesar Chavez on the labor movement to form the United Farmer Workers of America to create this movement for better working conditions. And so they shared a lot of experiences of racism in the labor movement and classism, and were able to support their union through a multiracial lens. And I thought that was really cool of seeing that interracial unionizing and movement building. And so here are some of the sources that talk about those articles between the Filipino community and the Latinx community.
That was awesome. Before we move to the next portion, I was wondering if anyone had any comments or burning questions regarding some of those national labor activists that Yordonos mentioned, or some of the movements that were mentioned. Is that where rednecks come from? Yeah, that's interesting. I actually didn't know that before this presentation either. Just another example of how whiteness treats poor whites as expendable to further preserve whiteness, Erdasia says. Yup. All right, so the next thing we want to talk about today is the labor movement.
Oh, I think Erdasia had a hand up.
Go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say that again. And then I was thinking of a different example, but it just left me completely. But yeah, like I said, it's just like whiteness does this often, where like it turns our gaze onto poor whites who are categorized as like not smart and like extremely racist. And so I just, yeah, like learning about this is really, and I've also always heard about like unions being, especially like white unions being not allowing Black people in. So to be learning of this history of long continual interracial, multiracial fights in labor is, yeah, it's dispelling a lot of myths in my head that, again, this is what whiteness does. That's all.
Right on.
I was just gonna like super quickly say, it was like, yeah, exactly, like literally on that point of like, all these myths have been made about like the racism of unions without like taking into account, which is true, like there are valid points, there's positives and negatives, but the point of like there are tons of multiracial, like that I also like really enjoyed reading through Yordonos' slide and like doing my own separate research of like this, that like there are so many coalitions that came across so many boundaries because they knew what would the successes would be. Like there were activists that, especially coal miners have really gotten a brunt end of this kind of, have gotten the brunt end of like the most extreme working conditions, and they still do to this day. And so there's all these mine workers that still work in some of the most abysmal conditions you can possibly see, but they get blinded by the fact that like they get all these messaging that, oh, this person's against you, when most of the time that person next to you has been raised in the same community and knows the same people and knows the same values. And really those divisions of using like identity politics in this like horrendous way have really divided us, when we can really unite as working class, and have succeeded drastically when we unite for working class ideals. Like the coal miners used to fight for, oh, amazing, Rainbow Coalition. I love Rainbow Coalition conversations. but like the coal work, a lot of the coal miners fighting in the 20s for their own rights just wanted like running water. They wanted full baths. They wanted ability to make more than like $1 a day. So think about like the extreme conditions and how to this day there have been so many gains, but there's also still so many gains to come in like any form of these kind of actions of coalitions of people.
Right, right. And I was thinking as it was going along, I was talking to Yordonos earlier, nothing has frightened the current power structure so much as these coalitions, from Bacon's Rebellion, which was the birth of the Black Codes to keep the poor whites and the enslaved Black people of that Virginian colony separate. That formed out of coalition building between the two groups. They were like, we've got to separate these groups and make sure that, one of them knows that they're better than the other, so that way they don't come after us. Then we saw it again in 1968 with Dr. Martin Luther King's Poor People's Campaign, which in a newly desegregated South was bringing white poor workers in this unionization. I think it was the sanitation workers. And that was the year that Dr. King was assassinated. That was the year where the civil rights movement's momentum started to decelerate. And after that group was torn apart, we saw the birth of the war on drugs in 1970. Great discussion. All right, so now we're going to talk something a little more personal. The labor movement here in Florida, and at some point we're going to center Tampa, Florida. But Yordonos mentioned earlier that it's important to discuss the impact of the Black resistors that were in forced servitude in the United States. The impact that they've had on the labor movement is undeniable. And that's true in Florida as well. We hardly ever hear about Florida slave resistance, let alone Florida slavery. But that was obviously a real thing. Obviously, we can't go through this discussion without discussing slavery, white supremacist violence, anti-Blackness, and the brutality of slavery. So just keep that in mind. Labor movements do often fail to discuss the significance of Black resistors who resisted against the white ownership in the United States and the colonies preceding the United States. A lot of what you see from the slavery resistance exists in modern labor union resistance today. And a lot of the way you see slave owners navigated the world sort of mirrors how the employer and employee relationship is. Now, I'm not saying that to compare working at, a retail store for a low wage. That's not the same thing as being in forced servitude. And I'm not comparing the two struggles because that's not helpful or necessary. But there is definitely things rooted in the resistance against slavery that we use in the resistance against the current employer and employee structure. Most of what I'm gathering from that is from Florida's Dissenters, Rebels, and Runaways, Territorial Days to Emancipation by Larry Eugene Rivers. When Florida was known as La Florida, it was a Spanish colony that happened in 1513. It was a three-tier society when it came to the Black race and the white race. There was your white Europeans, who were the freest people. Free Black individuals, of course, free is subjective. It just meant they weren't in the legal status of servitude. And then the enslaved Black individuals who were, of course, forced to give their labor to the colonizers from Spain. Once the Anglo-Saxons and the eventual United States got involved in 1821 and took over Florida, the free Black status slowly began to disappear. And there was now just white people, more specifically the Anglo-Saxons of the time, and Black people were all enslaved. There was no longer that free Black status. Everyday slave resistance in Florida was a thing. Slave resistance is seldom talked about, but Black people have always resisted oppression, both in very direct ways and sometimes in more subtle ways. Rivers cites many methods that enslaved African people used to resist their white oppressors. Many of the actions taken by these resistors mirror what we see in labor unions today as tactics to resist the employers and management. Although the majority of the enslaved people in Florida lived as nonviolent dissenters, some slaves did use physical resistance in the 19th century Florida. This came despite the fact that they knew there would be grave consequences for them and their families due to retaliation from white owners. As early as 1828, Florida's criminal code stipulated that anyone who was Black could suffer whippings and even death, depending on the severity of the crime committed, if they ever attacked a white slave owner. So most commonly, you saw more conservative forms of resistance, as Rivers calls it. Individuals forced into bondage in Florida used many different modes of resistance, and I think they mirror a lot of our labor union resistance modes today. Speaking their minds despite the risks, which was a huge risk, that's similar to filing a grievance with a union against the management. Learning to read and write, gaining literacy, things like this workshop and understanding unions and understanding your rights is how we gain literacy in unions today. Becoming a troublesome property, being that person that the slave owner was, watch out for this person, they're organizing, they're recruiting, that kind of thing. Feigning illnesses or exaggerating injuries to get time off, ceasing or greatly slowing down their work, which of course mirrors a work stoppage. Taking possession of property, livestock, and food that, quote, belonged to the plantation owners. This is a form of asset redistribution. Very early on, it's not usually documented as labor resistance, but it's what mirrors a lot of labor resistance today. Some Black people were known as, and by the way, I can't see the chat, Tatiana, so if someone chimes in, please let me know. If a lot of Black people enslaved in Florida organized other Black people in Florida, even during the antebellum time, most commonly Black women, and they fought for better working conditions on in a group basis. And this very much mirrors what we know as collective bargaining. So, I mean, there was a lot of fear related to this type of organizing. The oppressive class, the oppressor class, was very afraid of this type of collective bargaining because they were worried about what is, quote, coded as violence, I would say is self-defense when you're in forced servitude. But there was a violent action right here in Tampa, Florida, due to a slave resistor. He wanted to resist slavery, and then as a result, he murdered his, quote, employer, that's the way they worded it, Luke Moore, right here in Tampa, Florida. He was found guilty by a jury because, of course, but it caught the attention of an abolitionist attorney down here in Florida who would eventually be a governor, Ocean B. Hart. And this attorney fought Adams' guilty conviction and actually got it overturned. But Adam was unfortunately met with vigilante justice through slave owners that did a lynch mob because they were upset about this and they were worried about what this would do to their position as the oppressor. So fast forward a little bit into the future and we can learn a little bit about how Ybor was a mutual aid society and a labor haven. We know much about the history of Ybor, like our beautiful cigar factories, but we don't talk a lot about the Spanish, Cuban, and Italian clubs having originally been clubs of resistance and mutual aid. You may not know that Black Cubans lived in homes next to white Cubans and Sicilians. You may not know that Ybor refused to segregate their streetcar while the rest of Tampa moved from Reconstruction to Jim Crow. You may not know that a lot of labor strikes were coordinated by Black Cubans, Spanish Cubans, and Sicilians in Ybor. Racial harmony in the 1900s in the South sounds made up. And when I say harmony, I do want to be cognizant of the fact that this doesn't mean it was a utopia or that there were no isms present. That doesn't sound like that would be rooted in reality. But when we look at the living conditions in Ybor in the early 1900s compared to the rest of Tampa, it was definitely a lot more harmonious, so much that while North and South Tampa had segregation signs for white and colored in parts of the city, Ybor did not have that. Black Cuban resident Alfonso Diaz once said, in Ybor City, you'd live with an Italian on one side, a Spaniard and a Cuban on the other side. Likewise, Black Cuban Juan Malaya said, the Caltagerones, Scagliones, the Martinos, all these people lived across from us. There was no such thing as a white section and a Black section. The only time you encountered discrimination was when you left Ybor. That's always been very interesting to me. And then when we tie it to the fact that there's a lot of early labor strikes that occurred in Ybor between 1887 to 1920, there's actually a lot more than what's going to be listed here, but there was a strike in 1887. So although Ybor did believe in solidarity in general, there was still some ethnic strife, particularly between the Cubans and the Spaniards, most likely due to the fact that at the time, the Cuban Revolution movement was to decolonize Cuba from Spain. So there was probably some strife between both groups related to that. Obviously here, these are snippets that were found from the Tampa Striking Cigar Workers website that they have, which is very interesting. I recommend checking out. The 1887 began when Spanish workers demanded that a popular Cuban foreman in the Martinez Ybor cigar factory be fired for dismissing a Spanish worker because of his nationality. So it became a thing of ethnic strife there. When the managing partner of the firm, Eduardo Menrara, a Cuban, refused to do so, Spanish workers walked out. After several weeks, the striking Spanish workers did come back, and a short time later, the foreman who had caused the crisis was fired, and now the Cubans went out and took to the street. The situation eventually quelled once this man just left Tampa. Then again in 1889, there was a 98-day-long strike in reaction to the owners demanding the use of scales to weigh out the filler tobacco given to the workers at the beginning of the day. For skilled cigar makers, that was an insult. Over 4,000 cigar workers left their benches. From April to August, the strike paralyzed the entire region. Only 6 factories continued production because those workers did not get involved in that conflict. In late August, the workers returned to their benches. So 98-day work stoppage over the type of equipment that was going to be used in the cigar factory. I can't imagine having that kind of bargaining power in my workplace now. 1901, Fortune Taylor, who was an enslaved Black woman eventually freed and then became a property owner here in Florida, bridged the gap between the city of West Tampa, a separate city at the time, and the city of Tampa, which was known as Anglo Tampa. Her bridge was the only thing that helped the cigar industry in West Tampa thrive. Without her bridge, there would have been no way to get these products between the bridge. However, it got damaged in 1901. So 1,000 workers from West Tampa marched across the Polk Street Railroad Bridge to Hillsborough County Courthouse to protest the lack of progress on repairing the Fortune Street Bridge. Closure meant that citizens whose homes and jobs were located across the river had to take a trolley to the riverbank, board a boat across the river. So again, they were basically transit insecure, and they were protesting that. So they decided to stop for one day and march the courthouse. Basically, that prompted the mayor to fix it. So in other words, the mayor did not wake up one morning and say, let me fix the Fortune Taylor Bridge. The mayor was compelled to do so by the organizing of thousands of West Tampans. Cigar workers unions in Tampa. Who were these workers? Mostly Black Cubans, Spanish Cubans, and Sicilians. At the time, there was Latin Tampa and Anglo Tampa. Anglo Tampa primarily appeased white Anglo-Saxon people and relegated Black Americans to segregated areas, including the historic Central Avenue, known as the Scrub. Latin Tampa, while most definitely imperfect, was a mutual aid society that believed in solidarity, and that included creating labor unions that resulted in several general strikes and numerous walkouts. It affected labor relations, and it also increased the popularity of radical social ideologies. Socialism and anarchism were particularly popular in early 1900s Ybor. Factory workers were increasingly feeling the pressure of modern corporate development. Many believed that it was necessary for them to modernize their operations to remain competitive in the marketplace. So the owning class was worried about their profits and keeping up with other factories, perhaps in the US or international, and they weren't worried about the conditions of their workers, which is not surprising. In 1910, there was a resistance when factory owners, particularly anxious to acquire good selectors for their businesses, were outraged when those individuals were deported by immigration. Manuel Lopez, a Cuban selector, was returned to Havana on board the steamer Boliviete for being in violation of the alien contract. So that must have been some form of employment clause for immigration back then. So this discrimination against immigrant workers goes very far back. By August, there was a strike resulting this. There was a strike with over 12,000 men out of work. In January of 1911, with the tacit complicity of the federal immigration officials in Tampa, manufacturers determined to crush the strike to prevent more economic losses, decided with massive additions of strike breakers created the stop. So during the strike's early months, cigar workers from Havana had been deported by immigration officials as contract laborers. Tampa's second general strike in a decade again came to an unhappy end for cigar worker unions. Defeated but still defiant, workers returned to factories, some of them relocated. So unfortunately, this resistance didn't work as favorably for a lot of the workers, especially those that had an immigrant status. There was a few resistances between that one and 1931. However, we can't go over all of them today. There's a lot, so they're worth checking out. 1931 is Tampa's most famous labor resistance. In 1931, racial solidarity in Ybor was beginning to wane as the city of West Tampa was annexed by Main Tampa, and Main Tampa would begin enacting state law in Ybor, which mandated segregation. On November 28th of 1931, the cigar workers met at the Ybor City Labor Temple and organized a strike to protect the cigar factory lectors after they were banned by the cigar firms. The strike failed, bringing about an official end to the lector tradition. So who were lectors? Today, when we're at work, we might listen to iTunes or Spotify. In the 1920s, cigar workers had lectors. These lectors were paid to read to the workers. They weren't reading just anything, though. They were reading works about socialism, communism, and labor building. Despite the changing culture of Ybor due to Anglo Tampa's annexation, the Communist Party of Ybor started to grow in numbers, largely because of the work of these lectors. That, of course, resulted in the beginning of the Depression, 1931. Cigar workers allied with the Communist Party took the streets of Ybor City. This was designed to march to City Hall over the fact that the lectors had been terminated from the cigar factory. So they were no longer having that revolutionary work read to them. This resulted in a confrontation with police, and a police officer was shot and another hit in the head with a brick. In the aftermath of that violence, 24 cigar workers were placed under arrest. The cigar manufacturers took to the fact that there was, quote, violence that happened and blamed it on the fact that there were lectors. They agreed to once again remove the lectors from Ybor City factories. Needless to say, workers were not happy about that decision. So on November 28, 1931, they organized a strike across all of Ybor City to save the lectors. Some 7,000 workers came together and stopped working immediately, taking the streets for 3 whole days and holding out until December 7. The workers didn't get their way despite their communal efforts. Now, mind you, the Depression had just begun. So people were beginning to feel the heat of the economic duress they were in. And that is a barrier to collectively bargaining against your employer and striking if you are worried about your economic standing. The lector system came to an end as the workers could not hold out any longer without employment. So again, it tells us that sad, same tale of the sad cost of assimilation and whiteness, as Erdeja mentioned before. Spanish Cubans and Sicilians eventually turned their back on Black Cubans and other Black Americans. The sweet taste of the, quote, American dream and the devastating defeat of the labor uprisings turned toward docility and assimilation. But Black people did not take it lying down. They continued to resist and continued to build and create the historic scrub on Central Avenue, which used to be a vibrant Black business district. As Jim Crow began to migrate to Ybor City and the Spanish Cubans pushed out their Black brethren even more, many Black Cubans found acceptance on Central Avenue. This prosperity was something that could be enjoyed by Black Cubans who had deflected from the Spanish rule, as well as newly freed Black Americans. The scrub was an affectionate title they had given themselves. And in Reconstruction of Tampa, these individuals built a vibrant business life and a cultural congregation for Black people to find community in, very similar to the mutual aid communities that used to be in Ybor. All right, so Tatiana is going to take the next part, but I want to open if anyone has questions, thoughts, or comments about that part. Oh, I see Ardesia and Carla had to go, but we will make sure they get the slides. I know, right? I can go on about Ybor all day, and yes, we should have a sequel about the scrap.
I was just gonna say that I absolutely adore the amount of history you have toward the amount of history you really hold toward Ybor and the love and respect you have, and it's really earned because there's just so many examples of working people coming together and really trying to educate themselves and trying to educate themselves in a way to empower their communities. Like the lectors are. I just thought about like what would be a modern day lector if like there was someone at Amazon reading Wretched of the Earth, like reading radical texts, and like how that would like really change the minds of like large scale organizations and things like that. I think would be just like I don't know. I just think it's fascinating how this history that is like so beautiful and fascinating has been almost completely destroyed and deleted. Because like literally, I would watch an entire show about the lectors, like their stories, their histories, like that alone. I think is like so worth going into.
Stay tuned for City Council Watch. we're gonna try to probably put something like that together, to be honest.
Oh, awesome, awesome.
I see a hand raised, but I don't see who.
Yeah, you guys are welcome to unmute and speak.
Hey, I wanted to say that I believe in Cuba they still do have lectors, and I wanted to also say that it's really important to analyze those historical events to a broader theory that solely working in the workplace historically has shown that like it builds power to immediate needs, but in the long term, if there is not a spilling into the political realm, it becomes taken away. And I think like we see that too with like the union gains that we had in the early 1900s and how they've been slowly destroyed, where like now we don't have the 8-hour workday. So like, and I say that specifically in regards to like the Communist Party of Ybor organizing the workers, which I believe is what their idea was. They organized the workers, but that ultimately it must also spill into a political to truly help the workers have power over their lives.
I agree. Yeah, I think that their strategy long term was to go from workplaces to the politics, and I think at some points in Ybor's history they did.
Can I just ask a quick question?
Uh-huh.
I'm new to the area, so I'm just what's some of the best writing on either the 1931 strike or on Ybor communists? Is there a book or an article, and maybe it's in the chat and I missed it, that y'all recommend to read up on first?
There are tons of articles and ethnographies, especially from USF. And there's quite a few books on it. Sometimes it's in books specifically about it. Some of it I found through books, for example, centering on Italian workers is how I found some of it for this stuff. But I don't have like a specific title off the top of my head, but I do have the sources that I pulled it from, and I'd be happy to send it to you. So that way you can start kind of backtracking my research and finding what you like to read. Because I'm not a big reader, like as far as the whole thing, but just taking like chapters I really like out of it.
Yeah, that was incredible. Thank you. And I like that you brought in the international lens, kind of thinking of this as the Atlantic world, right? So like it's labor activism happening in the context of colonialism throughout the entire region, the entire hemisphere.
Yep. Thank you. Oh, awesome, Tatiana. Thanks for those links.
Yeah, both of them are actually great. Like I found them as you guys were talking, and both were really great at combining kind of the information about labor activism in Ybor, combined with like the history of the Communist Party in Florida and Ybor and throughout Cuba, which I think is like they are so intrinsically tied in a way that I don't think you can divide them. And the way that they've been divided has been a way that the history of Ybor has just been like whitewashed away into the city, where Ybor should be one of the most like amazing parts of Tampa has turned into like a party nightmare where people lick feet. Anyways, I was just gonna say if anyone had any more comments, questions before I start, just gonna leave the floor open for a minute.
Oh, well, I just want to say real quick, one thing that fascinates me is how you can stand there in a place with a park dedicated to Jose Marti, a revolutionary socialist, and then go out there and march against socialism in the name of Ibor's history. That just fascinates me.
Oh, absolutely. Especially like I see that a lot more with like the history of Cesar Chavez, and like how his history is so integral to uprising in Latin America and throughout like the whole like throughout the world. Like his impact is so beyond what has been displayed, and how like there's so many things in recognition of his achievements. But the most people hear is like, oh yeah, this is someone that was horrible and didn't care about whatever, like all the lies, all the same lies that divide people. And I think it's really important to like really attack those things with the history of people coming together and working together under a united cause to help their common man. So I wanted to start with debunking labor union myths, and I actually really ended up changing not my perspective, but my ideal of how to address this kind of like the myths that we've been fed, especially in the South, especially in Florida. There's so much like attacking and debunking and myths just thrown at us from every angle. Like one of the biggest things that I thought about was, why do these myths get perpetuated? Why do these myths get pushed? And it's because they're effective. The lies are effective. It's the same way that misinformation and disinformation is so effective, because you catch onto the lie and the shred of doubt, and you don't know the truth to attack that shred of doubt. And why do they attack unions? Why have we historically attacked unions? It's mostly, sorry, I just turned my phone off, and it's beeping like crazy. Why they attacked unions, and what like the role of a union is just collective, if people collectively working, no matter what like form, no matter what ideal, either from the slaves working together to revolt against their masters, to people in a tech company deciding to work as slow as possible to like literally work to the rules so that their laborer can't get the labor they need, but they can still have the stability of their jobs. And really, I want you to think through all these myths, like, why do they do that? What are the tactics that they use? What purpose does this provide? And why is misinformation used? And why do corporations and politicians support these views? Like, I want you to really think through all those questions, because I think they're integral with why do these lies spread? And why do these lies still, like all of us that are very active and aware and knowledgeable, still lean into them on a rainy day? So I also want to talk about one of the biggest things that they do to attack, you can leave it on that slide, to attack workplaces. And one of the biggest things that they do is, you'll go to work, you'll hear something anti-union at your morning meeting. There'll be literature handed out, so when you get there, you have like flyers that say unions will steal your babies. And then when you get to the break area, there's TVs that have anti-union commercials. And then you get home and you get anti-union commercials. And radio, TV, and in your mail you get anti-union lit. So I want that to be clear that like this isn't a light endeavor. Companies spend an average, most of the companies you can think of spend an average, or collectively spend $340 million a year. And that number has only gone up. Like the more money these corporations make, the larger they spend on union avoidance, or like union blockers, like in the fight at Amazon and all over. These same methodologies have been used, and they beat it into you because they have the ability to, and it's not illegal to do that. And I really think that it's something to be aware of. Like, they hire consultants who exploit the weaknesses of labor laws to scare workers out of their rights, their collective right to bargain for their rights, and how effective that bargaining is the second you even start thinking about it. So things like that I really think is important to just have like a conversation about what unions are, and how unions are simply a democratic organization of working people standing up for their rights on the job and in society. And I actually would like to expand that definition, because I've seen more organizations grow that aren't working people, that there are unemployed unions that are unhoused unions that are starting in the Northeast. And there's tenants unions here that Carla's actually a very big part of, that just left, that are local, that are doing big fights just as collective people realizing their power in fighting back against the establishment. And those accomplishments are far beyond I didn't know caregiving unions were a thing, but I agree. D'Angelo and I were talking about some other forms of unions earlier in Yordonos, and there's all different types of unions that are just people coming together, and that ideal is what needs to be protected and pushed. And understanding that all this misinformation is to push away the beauty and collective power of unions, because they are so effective. So are they right for me in my workplace? So some of the myths are that workers can be forced to join unions, which is a lie. workers are not forced to join unions. Mostly unions are effective to, like, no worker, no matter what union it is, you are not forced to join. Unless you are outside of a right to work state where everyone automatically pays in, but you don't have to join and be a part of it if you don't want to. And unions mean more conflict in the workplace. That's not true. That's not true. That's not true. Unions work by collective bargaining, by democratic agreements, by the workers saying, we want these things, and it creates a structure to actually create that conversation to move forward. And companies close due to unions. Companies close due to a lot of things. If Amazon, or let me give a better example, if Uber Eats dies tomorrow, that's Uber Eats' fault for being an unprofitable business that constantly exploits their laborers. And unionized companies are by far more successful, are by far happier because they have better collective they have better collective resources and communication outside of companies now where, like, I joined a company through this pandemic and we don't really communicate as often because of the literal distance that we put under. And having unions is a way that is a separate entity that actually works through the workplace to make us work together. And I think that, like, all the lies that are presented, that unions are incredibly effective at prioritizing the needs of the classes that they work through. Such like teachers unions are one of the most effective unions that are still in the country, and the Chicago's Teachers Union is one of the most effective teachers unions to ever exist because they did such work to actually help give resources. And one of the biggest things is that the companies and union membership decrease when union membership has pretty much been steady. It's been low because of the fact that the workplace and the workforce has changed a lot through the gig economy. But 16 million men and women, including my mother, are union members and are very proud and happy to be union members. And there are current union fights that are happening, especially locally, that are currently trying to unionize more workers. So anywhere that you see a union, really take a minute and try to, like, lean into what they're doing and learn about their message. I'm not saying join, I'm not saying jump in, because it may not be your company. But when there are fights like McDonald's, Walmart's, Amazon's, even to, like, the airport, to educational system, TA unions and, like, educator unions that are fighting back in all these different methods, really take in that they are an effective force. So next slide, please. Thanks for dropping the information on SEIU's home care division. I will love to read that because I literally did not know about that. So that's amazing. So myths, unions just want worker dues. Partially, yeah, they do want your dues, but the dues tend to stay between 9 to 10% of your salary. It's going to be less than taxes. And when it would come in, there's no way, unless you or the majority of your coworkers in a contract, like, voted to take money out of pocket, would be that you were losing money. It's far more a small amount of money that really does come in. Like, most unions, they only start collecting dues once the contract has been agreed to by the entire union. It's not like day one, here, give me $10. No, it's day 100 after a bunch of meetings really talking about the values and the goals of the union. There are unions that aren't fighting, like tech unions, aren't really fighting for pay increases because they do make a lot of money. Tech unions are fighting for working rights that are like fair hours, fair access to information, and things like that. So really adjusting the ideal of what the unions want and what they should achieve is that they want the worker dues to go into collective funds to create collective action that is decided by the collective. So, and that unions used to be effective. Yeah, I would say unions in the United States used to be more effective, but if they increase and they grow, they can be as effective as countries that have over 80% unionization, that where even a whiff of striking comes in, they immediately just accede to what the workers want, because they know that losing profit isn't worth actually giving the workers what they need. So, and that unions are for the upper class, and that is a lie. That is incorrect. Unions are for whoever needs them, whatever like, if there's there are upper class people that do actually support the needs and wants of the working class. And I think unions are for whatever workers or collective people want to fight for them. And so the truth is that union dues are instrumental, but they're chosen by the union workers. You decide what it would be through working with either a union that you're already working with, like SEIU, or other unions like that. And that unions are extremely effective all over the world, and they've been effective here at doing amazing things. The great deal wouldn't have been achieved if it wasn't for the massive pressure of labor unions pushing for actual better protections for the workers. And unions are for anyone who wants them. If you want to start a union because of like their name, like one of the biggest unions in the world in the United States are police unions. They may not be the greatest thing, but police unions have drastically been effective. The police union here is incredibly effective at pushing lies, propaganda, messaging. And imagine if all the other workplaces that are like 4 times the size of the police union locally were able to fight back in that same way and give the protections that police have because of these unions. So next slide, please. So unions are no longer necessary. Wrong. Unions are totally necessary. I don't know if you've heard of places like Amazon where people are having to pee in bottles because they don't have access to breaks. I think they're incredibly necessary because we still have a long ways to go to actually fight for our working class, just like the coal miners that are currently fighting, just like the Amazon workers that are fighting. Unions are fighting every single day and are fighting for a better quality of work because work changes. Work has changed drastically through the invent of technology, through the growth of technology, through the growth of the change of the economy. Unions are incredibly necessary, and they're key to regaining power for the workers who truly have the power. If every Amazon plant stopped working, Amazon would change drastically tomorrow because they know they could not deal with that profit loss, because that's how it is. And that's why we need to push these fights and support these fights when they're happening. There are many union fights that happen all over the world, and we need to support them. And so unions are quickly shrinking. Yeah, they've been shrinking, but it's been shrinking and changing throughout the way the working class has changed. And either way, there's still a very large majority of people in the United States that are part of unions, and the number has been pretty steady in the way that it's declined and how the workforce has changed through all these like problems such as the pandemic that we're all in and the economy changing through the gig economy. And that unions force workers to strike out often. They don't. The unions work by the collect. If the workplace wants to strike everyone in the workplace wants to strike every 2 weeks, that's their right. But collective bargaining is one of the biggest keys to solving the crisis of economic inequality and benefit inequality. The fact that if every single Uber driver stopped tomorrow and said we want benefits and completely just fought on the rights of we want healthcare benefits, they would win. But the problem is these companies spend so much money to legislate and push our legislators to pass things like Prop 22 in California that made the gig workers get even less rights than they had before, and fighting for the rights of the corporations and not the people. And that's why the people need to come together and take back the fact that their managers aren't doing the work. We are doing the work at every instance. And that unions work by the thing I really want to get across is that unions work by the needs and control of the workers. That nothing happens without the union coming together and agreeing. And workers in most unions, they vote. Like, they have to be voted. And they have to be settled without, mostly get settled without a strike. Most people don't want to strike. They don't want to take off time of work because they know that will attack their own work productivity. But if it's what the workplace deems necessary and what the workers agree, that's how it works. Some 91% of union contract negotiations are settled without a strike because the company does not want that. As much as the workers don't want it, the company massively does not want it, and they usually lean over and go with whatever reconciliation they feel the workers want because it's effective. So I really want to encourage you to take these information and fight back those things that you'll hear from your workplaces saying that they shouldn't unionize, because they should. They should absolutely rise. Because right now, CEO compensation has grown over 940% since 1978, which isn't that far away. And worker compensation has only risen 12%. And that was before the pandemic, where right now there are companies like Google asking their work from home employees to cut their salaries to work from home, which I think is abysmal, because all workers should be increasing more, should be increasing wages, should be increasing benefits, should be reintroducing pensions that have almost completely disappeared and turn into stock benefits, when pensions are usually what people want to support them and stabilize them through their retirement. But we've lost all this sight through all the propaganda and messaging that has been fed to us constantly. And we really need to look at these messages being thrown at us and push back. And the image here, the unions can't and we can, and the previous one said do's mean don'ts, those are direct images coming from, these are actually from Amazon fights that Amazon puts up all over their workplaces about lies and misinformation from unions. So really taken, these companies are fighting so hard to just spread misinformation about something that is so good and is so historically valid for being good. So yeah, absolutely, farm workers that are right now really must be, the undocumented farm workers must really, really be fighting right now because of the fact that they must be working in conditions that are extremely dangerous. I know Tesla broke labor laws by opening some of its factories way too early in the pandemic, and then they got shut down immediately because of outbreaks. And like these things are so necessary because at every moment these bosses will absolutely sell out the rights and the interests of, oh yes, incarcerated workers union, absolutely. Like really the interests of the people are there and want to work together. We just need to make sure that we fight all this propaganda at every inch because they are fighting us. But the one thing they can never win is understanding what the people want, the people deserve, and will get when they come together. So next slide. So fun fact, why is the labor stoppage called a strike? Because in 1768, English sailors that were unhappy about wage reductions expressed their discontent by removing the sails on their ships in the port of London, which is called striking. I didn't know that at all, and I thought that was sick. And it really showed me, like, I'm someone that's incredibly aware of the historical actions against imperialist states, and I did not know that's where the word came from. And it's crazy because 9 years later, after 1768, some pretty bold political action occurred. Maybe you've heard of it. Maybe it was the revolution that started this country, but it was due to increasing discontent with oppression, and they chose to fight back. And it worked because we're all here in this crazy country, but all of our history is so tied to fighting against oppression and just the way that workers are constantly pushed down and marginalized when the workers truly control the labor force. And that's all on my section. Off to Yordonos. Oh, if anyone has any questions to ask in between our switch, you're welcome to ask right now.
Yeah, and I definitely appreciate the mention there of the incarcerated workers unions, farm workers. One thing that's really interesting, this doesn't have to do with local movements, but one thing that was really interesting to me when it comes to farmer workers, Christina, is the Sicilians in the late 1890s tried to organize against the new unified Italian government. And when the Sicilians reached out to other European labor organizers, they said that this doesn't really count because it's farm work. That was a real thing that happened in Europe. And I think it's interesting how sometimes farm workers are not considered labor. And I don't understand where that mentality comes from. There you go, domestic. Yeah, it's considered domestic work. So it's sort of like what used to be called, quote, a homemaker wasn't thought of as labor, but anyone who's ever done any of those tasks.
Let me add one thing on that. I love what you're saying there, Angel. Yeah, I think part of it is that they're actively written out of the legislation itself, right? Domestics, farm workers, agricultural workers, predominantly Black and brown, being written out of laws that actually protect the rights of workers. Thinking about like the New Deal laws and the legislation in the 30s during the Depression. So some of that is just the state actively devaluing a particular set of labor and removing it from the equation.
Very true.
Oh yeah, absolutely. In Florida, think about like who hasn't impacted minimum wage laws, bartenders, like half the people that work at Disney apparently, because they're all subcontractors. Like everything where there's a division between the head and the like minority, there will be an act of the state pushed by the capital owners to push back on the rights of the workers. And look at that in every context. I really did like the example of the incarcerated workers unions, because incarcerated workers make pennies a day. They almost make $1 a day. And this is right here in Florida, and they are in some of the worst conditions. Most Florida jails don't have AC at any level, which is horrifying, considering if you stand outside in Florida for like 30 minutes, you probably will pass out. So think about the conditions, especially during COVID. Yeah, the fact that if you get COVID in a Florida jail, they will pretty much put you into solitary confinement for however long they deem necessary, which is literally torture while you're going through a horrible disease. And really understanding how like the needs for these instances and supporting these people at every end is necessary. I know a lot of incarcerated workers unions ask for books because their books constantly get thrown or pushed away from the jail guards and all those people, when they really want, like, the people want change. The people can feel the discontent. You can feel it in the air, which is so important for fighting back. Oh yes, sex workers. Angela literally brought up some of the drag workers this year in Tampa that were trying to unionize. Like, I really want you guys to take from this that any collective of people can come together to push back against the owners of capital or the owners of their oppression. Because if you're a bartender making like $1 an hour, we need to talk about how that is incorrect because you are a part of the labor force, and increases to wage and benefits should apply to everyone in the labor force, no matter if you're a bartender or you're a balloon popper or if you're an inmate at a jail, who I would argue the inmates who are bound by the legalization of slavery in prisons need the most support for our workers, for our most support and community engagement. So really pushing the ideas of what your role as a community member can be in supporting all of these actions, and really pushing forward what we need, because everyone in here probably is an example of being in a workforce and being treated like trash, being things that were blatantly illegal, blatantly incorrect, blatantly dangerous happening, and that's where we need to push back in every instance. And if anyone here knows any other examples of local fights, local coalitions or anything, send it forward to us. We'd love to support, we'd love to boost, and we'd love to truly just push the fact that the history of Tampa and the history of Ybor and the history of our communities is through collective struggle.
Right on. And I like how you said the employers enacting things that are illegal. I wanted to add, sometimes they do things that are just barely legal or like gray area legal. And they just take advantage of the fact that we don't have a lot of mechanisms for our rights, which brings us to a good topic, the right to work. So saying the term right to work initially sounds pretty good when you hear the word, but it actually has a very dark history of where it comes from, what it actually does and means, and where it was actually co-opted from. The Right to Work Committee was founded in the United States in 1955, but there was organizing way before that time with a goal of enacting right to work laws even on a national level, including attempts to do a national amendment to make the United States in its entirety a right to work nation, which would absolutely be terrible. So let's talk about the origins of the phrase right to work. It was coined by French socialist leader Louis Blanc in light of the social turmoil of the early 19th century and rising unemployment in that 1846 financial crisis leading to the French Revolution of 1848. At that time, the right to property was crucial demand in early quest for political freedom and equality and against feudal control of property. Property can serve as the basis for entitlements that ensure the realization of the right to an adequate standard of living. And it was only property owners which were initially granted that civil and political right, including the right to vote in France, not dissimilar to the early United States. Because not everybody is a property owner, their right was enshrined to allow everybody to attain an adequate standard of living. Today, discrimination on the basis of property ownership is recognized as a serious threat to the equal enjoyment of human rights. But that wasn't the case then. So essentially, if you didn't have property, you often didn't have the right to work and get employment. So that's where right to work comes from. So it was a socialist action originally for the workers and then co-opted into this conservative pro-management phrase. Enacted in 1935, the National Labor Relations Board created better organized labor conditions in the United States during the Great Depression. This was part of the Second New Deal. It created an act that allowed companies to agree to the following union types: a closed shop, in which all employees must be members of the union as a condition of the employment. So you cannot work for, this was originally the case, you could not work for certain employers if you did not join that union. A union shop, which allows for hiring non-union employees, but providing that they join the union within a certain period of time. Agency shop, in which employees must pay the equivalent of the cost of union representation, but they don't actually have to join or go to any of the meetings or vote or anything like that. And an open shop, in which an employee cannot be forced to join or pay equivalents of the dues to the union. So the law actually originally created 4 versions of unions in the workplace. However, it got gutted in 1947, just after World War II. In 1947, Congress passed the Labor Management Relations Act of 1947, generally known as the Taft-Hartley Act, and it was vetoed by President Harry S. Truman. My guess is it got a veto override. The act repealed some parts of the Wagner Act, including outlawing the closed shop. So essentially, they got rid of the ability for you to mandate unionship for a certain employer. So there are no longer closed shop unions in the United States. This was basically what set the development of early right to work laws. In the early development of the right to work policy, segregationist sentiment was used as an argument, as many people in the South felt that it was wrong for Black people and white people to belong to the same unions. Vance Muse, one of the early developers of this policy in Texas, used that argument in the development of the first anti-union laws in Texas in 1940. So it all goes back to anti-Blackness and racism again. This is something found on a website advocating for the end of right to work. Right to work for less lowers and restricts access to benefits, drives wages down, and weakens our workplace safety roles. So that's just important to think of. Are right to work laws racist? Right to work laws impact everyone, but that doesn't mean they weren't rooted in anti-Blackness and racism in general. The modern right to work movement was founded in anti-communism fear and pro-segregationist attitudes in the 1940s. The Christian American Association, or CAA, formed with right to work as its primary slogan. However, they mixed into that opposition to the right for women and Black people to vote, pro-segregation, and opposition to child labor laws, among other popular conservative beliefs. In other words, they were walking around saying, support the right to work. And people would probably say, yeah, I support the right to work. And they'd say, oh, okay, sign this. And people would be like, okay. And it also is like right to work plus right to racism and anti-child labor laws. That's the kind of coded tools and language that was used back then. And that's why right to work is seemingly, by how it sounds like it should be a pro-worker slogan. Anti-Catholicism and anti-immigration beliefs of that time towards Irish and Italian immigrants were also popular, and anti-Semitism wasn't very far away either. So those xenophobic and ethnic centric beliefs helped dominate the right to work movement early on. Texas actually had 10% unionization of their private sector and was rapidly growing by 225%. This threatened what was known as the political order of the South, which I'm sure we can all imagine what that means. The Popular Congress of Industrial Organization and American Federation of Labor Groups were top dogs in recruiting for unions and had major political influence. Their lobbying efforts to oppose segregation turned many segregationists into outright anti-unionists. And an intentional association was created to paint all unions as acts of communism to instill fear into people. The CAA was successful in these scare tactics and lobbied for laws on the books to prevent striking, which they considered to be violence in 1941. Florida followed Texas and added their own brand of an anti-violence law, kind of reminding me of HB1, outlaw protest because that's considered violence, outlaw striking because that's considered violence, just seeing the historical trends there. In 1947, the CAA, as the main lobbyist behind the amendment of the National Labor Relations Act, which effectively ended the closed shop provision of unions and gave birth to the modern right to work framework. So that all started in the 40s and got to the head in 1947. Dr. Martin Luther King did address right to work laws during the civil rights movement in 1961. In our glorious fight for civil rights, we must guard against being fooled by false slogans such as right to work. It is a law to rob us of our civil rights and job rights. Its purpose is to destroy labor unions and the freedom of collective bargaining, by which unions have improved wages and working conditions of everyone. Wherever these laws have been passed, wages are lower, job opportunities are fewer, and there are no civil rights. I dare you to use that quote the next time your employer asks you your favorite MLK quote. Fun fact, who was Fred Koch? He was the founder of the Kansas version of the Christian American Association. Koch is the reason Kansas became a right to work state in the 1950s. His sons, Charles and David, went on to carry on this legacy by creating the modern day Tea Party. So yeah, the famous Koch brothers, Tea Party groups for Americans for Prosperity, which pushed for Michigan right to work law measures. That's rooted in a old school right to work activist in Kansas. So he's just carrying on that family legacy of oppressing workers and maintaining quote, political order in the United States. So a lot of people think right to work is a Southern problem. And while it is it's dominant in the South, and there is no Southern states that do not have right to work laws, as you can see by this map, it does expand to the Midwest, slightly in the north. I don't know what why the Delaware has a slightly different color. It seems to me that it may have some form of a right to work law. Even Guam has a right to work law, which is a US territory. And there's 4 states over there in the West that have right to work laws. So they are not just Southern situations, but they definitely are rooted in the South. They started down here as a way to keep racial order and class order in the South. That was the political order of the South. So now we're gonna come along. We still have 20 minutes in this space together. I think this would be a good time if we wanna just share any thoughts about anything you learned today or anything not discussed today.
I would just like to say thank you to the chat for really pushing a lot of putting up a lot of information about unions and organizations that I didn't even know about. So thanks to everyone for really participating in the chat.
Yeah, I really love how this is really just a two-way learning street. It's not just us giving a presentation and putting facts about different organizations and labor movements and activists, but it's just really engaging to see the questions that people have in the chat, to see additional information and things like that. So I really love the kind of mutual effort that we've all been doing in learning more. And I learned a lot more, not just from the presentation, but from you all as well with your feedback.
Absolutely agree. It kind of goes to mutual aid. Mutual aid is, providing needs when you have the need. When you have the resources, you provide the needs, and when you need the resource, someone in your community provides the needs, and it's an unconditional thing. I think the same is true with political education. 0% of us are at a point where we can say, oh, we don't need any more political education. All of us need it, and we need to do it forever. We're never going to be know-it-alls. Dr. Angela Davis is still engaging in political education, so we should be as well. So I think it's important that we share little pieces of information. And at times, if we're ever in a workshop and you're like, no, that doesn't sound right, I don't agree with that, that's how we're going to get better in our own framework and understanding. So I echo those sentiments. I really appreciate all the engagement.
I'll ask a question if I can. Thinking about our organization, or the People's Safety Coalition, as an abolitionist organization, how, learning the history that you just presented on, where do you see the connections to the work of abolitionists today? Do you think about abolitionists historically and their relationship to the labor movement? How did those intersect for you?
For me, and thank you for that question. For me, I have learned, especially over the last year, that abolition is, and this is a quote from Dr. Angela Davis, but it's not a direct quote, it's a paraphrase. She said, abolition is not about getting rid of or taking away. Abolition is about centering on what is missing and building anew. And when I think about how that works in the labor movement, I think how unions exist to abolish the conditions in society, or in their workplace rather, that they can't live with, whether it's segregation or discrimination or misogyny, sexual harassment, or any of those things, conditions that they cannot live with anymore. So they are abolishing the conditions. Abolitionists that work, prison abolitionists, or however you want to refer to them, that are working at abolition work, aren't just going out to burn down every jail tomorrow and then do nothing else. They're going out to abolish the conditions in society which makes a prison or police force even seem necessary, by doing mutual aid, ending poverty, ending discrimination. So I believe both abolitionists and unionists are abolishing the conditions and transforming them.
Yeah, I think Angel said it amazingly. I wanted to quote one of my favorite Black feminists, Audre Lorde. She quoted, "Yet without community, there is certainly no liberation, no future, only the most vulnerable and temporary armistice between me and my oppression." And I really think that the more you learn about history, the more you actually see support for organizations that want transformative and actually impactful justice. and equality through everyone, through community work. And I think unions, labor, working class, everything is that same idea of when the community comes together, the community succeeds. And when the community doesn't, the community fails. And I really think taking those ideals of working together and working as collectives is the most successful path forward, because I don't know if you guys have heard the news, but it's messy out there. And I think it's really important for us to really come together in times of challenge and strife to really make a better future for those that are currently struggling. Like the incarcerated workers, I think, are a perfect example of like going out, finding organizations that donate books to incarcerated workers. One of the things I was thinking was No Name's book project. There's a rapper named No Name, like called No Name, and she has a book club where they send, like, you read a book and they also send a revolutionary text to the incarcerated people, and they love them. They think it's amazing because they don't get this. The resources aren't there for them. And I think it's really important to support these people that want to grow and change, and also support them as a community, because we only work best when we are a community. So that's what I think totally lies in within the abolitionist mind frame and the abolitionist work form, because abolition mostly gets talked about with policing and racism, when I think abolition can really be applied to a lot of aspects of oppression and cruelty that are in lots of forms. So I hope that answered your question well.
Yeah, plus one what Tatiana said. I think the biggest connection between abolition and the labor movement for me is the collectiveness. Like labor unions and labor movements are only succeed if everyone comes together and is able to do that collective bargaining. And that's the same thing with abolition. And also, yeah, abolition applies to every sector of life and every sector of oppression, whether that's capitalism, racism, white supremacy, Islamophobia, etc. And I had another point and then I totally lost it. Oh, another thing about abolition is how it's really rooted in the people and not signified leaders. Even though we always see like specific leaders, like we pointed some out in here, but I feel like our history tends to just learn or teach about specific people as leaders of the movement, whether that was like Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., or even like radical leaders like Fred Hampton. Those people are individually like memorialized and I feel like almost romanticized to a certain extent as seeing as the leader of the movement, and therefore once they die they're just a martyr. And so I think people forget about the people that are living that still exist. A lot of people in Chicago that were part of the Black Panthers are still there and still fighting, and Fred Hampton's Jr. Son is also still fighting. And so I think that there's kind of like an over romanticization of individual leaders, specifically male leaders, and especially if they die at a younger age, like before 40. And so I think abolition is really tied to the community and saying we don't need leaders, the people are the leaders.
I really like what you said about the leaders and the faces of these movements. I think history is taught that way on purpose. I mean, even going back to Jesus, if you look at Jesus from a radical socialist standpoint, up to Dr. Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and Larry Kramer and Marsha P. Johnson and all these wonderful people who did wonderful things. I'm not discounting the things that they did, but it's often as though they're the face of the movement and it's sold as though they were the movement, but they were just products of that movement. They were products of that organizing, and they were just an outlet to get between the oppressed class and the oppressing class and those who were being neutral to it, which of course would be in effect the oppressing class, because neutrality is acceptance. So I think that it was just an idea of celebritizing and making sure it felt like you needed to be some exceptional person like Dr. King or like Rosa Parks in order to organize, and that Joe at Walmart or Mary on the bus bench, she could never, because she's not one of those exceptional people. And that's part of the American exceptionalism ideals we're taught. So while I don't ever want to water down those public figures' impact and the work and the sacrifices that they made just by being public figures, I think it's important to recognize that they are products of a larger organizing scheme. And there are so many faceless and nameless people behind these movements that we'll never learn about in history books, not even just because they're whitewashing them, but just because their names aren't known. They were just that person holding that sign or that voter registration booth or starting that strike, and we just don't know who they are. So I want to know, Yordonos, do you want to just take a few minutes to go over a few quick resources while we have 10 minutes?
Yeah, sure. You can go to the next slide. And then if people have more points that they want to discuss, feel free to put them in the chat too. So I just wanted to share with y'all some Tampa and St. Pete resources if y'all are interested. A lot of these are mostly mutual aid, but some of them are like organizing resources as well for folks that want to get involved. So I put Tampa Food Not Bombs, which distributes food to the houseless community and anyone who wants it as well. And so I put their information there if you want to follow them on social media, or if you want to volunteer, or if you yourself need food. Here's where they're distributing in the location and times. There's also a Tampa Free Fridge. I believe this is still open because I know they were like transitioning, but I think their new location is the Martial Arts Center. But I would just follow their social media because that's where all like the most up-to-date information. So just want to make sure folks are there. Oh, thank you for putting more updated information on the chat. So Food Not Bombs and the laundry program are not providing services on Saturdays anymore, which that's what it says in the PowerPoint. So I'll make sure to edit that. And there's also the People's Laundry program, which cleans people's laundry for folks that need it. And then I put the dates and times and meetup spaces there. And then there's some more on the next slide. So here are some, basically like a replica of what is in Tampa is in St. Pete. I personally live in St. Pete, like right next to the 275 bridge, so I'm like right across Tampa. So just in case there were some folks there that were interested, I put St. Pete Food Not Bombs, the St. Pete Free Food Fridge, which I believe as of right now, they're transitioning to a new location. So I'm not sure if they found a new location yet. A food pantry and also a free clinic that offers medical and dental service. And then the next slide after this is going to talk about different organizations and unions in the Tampa St. Pete region. So we have the People Safety Coalition, and we have our email there if you're ever interested in joining or want to have any questions or just want to reach out. So I listed some of the partner organizations in the coalition: Restorative Justice Coalition, which Angel is part of, Tampa People's Protest, Tampa Bay Activist Network, which Tatiana is part of, the Dream Defenders, For Our Future, Black Collective Movement, and Andrew Joseph Foundation. So here's a list of, and I might be missing a couple, but here are the main ones that I could think of that are part of the whole coalition, where we're meeting monthly to talk about different events we want to do, any political training we want to do, mutual aid, things like that. So you don't have to be an organization to be involved. If you're just an individual person, that's totally fine too. You can be involved as well. And then I just listed some local unions, the Tampa Tenants Unions and St. Pete Tenants Unions, which I think are really important as people are getting evicted out of their houses right now. So they help give mutual aid to people that are being evicted, and also just any action against any police that are trying to evict them. And they'll just like live stream and go to the person's apartment or house and making sure people have rights and just recording and things like that. So they're really grateful resources for anyone who's interested in housing. And then there's, of course, the SEIU, that's Florida-wide. And I also put some teachers and some minors and firefighter information as well for unions.
Thank you so much. So that's pretty much all we had. We were able to get through everything with some great discussion, and I learned a lot through what Yordonos and Tatiana put together, and I'm really glad folks were able to engage. We will send an email with a copy of the PowerPoints to everyone, and it may take a while before it lets me load up this video. So once the video gets loaded up, I'll let you know as well. Does Florida Rising have any people's assemblies? I've heard of Florida Rising, but I can't think of if they have anything. Does anyone know?
I can check because I know some people in Florida Rising. I know they have some folks in Orlando. I don't know about Tampa, but they might.
I'm the field manager for Florida Rising locally. We're currently working on it. Yeah, right now we're in between campaigns, between vaccine information to another one. So I'd say toward the end of October, we're gonna have another event or something going toward political action. But right now we're in between the campaigns, so not really right now.
Awesome. Oh yeah, that's awesome. Any other thoughts, questions, ideas, critiques? I think I see a hand up.
Yeah, I wanted to mention a point that Fred Hampton and Kwame Ture really emphasized that comes from Mao, and then Mao would emphasize from like Marx and Lenin, that the scientifically in society changes happen through the people. Like it's never been like y'all were saying, there's this great man theory that like one individual or a couple individuals changed society, but in reality it's been the masses of the people who have changed society. And the role of these people, Fred Hampton, Malcolm X, Dr. King, have been to educate the masses from what they knew, from practicing, from being with the masses, and from studying. But it's always been the masses, and it's always been the organized masses. Something that Kwame Ture from the All African People's Revolutionary Party talked a lot about was that organization is the most important thing. Whether it doesn't, at this moment, it doesn't really matter about being in the right organization or one single organization, but being an organization allows you to really change society. As an individual, he used to say like, there's no such thing as Rambo. Rambo is only in the movies. That there's not one person that's going to change everything. It is discipline and within an organization to change society. So I just wanted to mention that.
Absolutely, that's awesome and very true. It's very true. Anyone else have any final thoughts, questions, ideas? Well, I think everyone's been great. So I think we're good to conclude here, and everyone have a beautiful and safe day. And we'll send this out to everybody. You can share the PowerPoints with anybody. You can get them connected with us. If you think a lot of people would want a repeat of this workshop, of course, you can show them the video. Or if you feel like there's a group of people that would be engaged and want to discuss it in the way we did, we could host another workshop. We don't mind doing repeats. And don't forget to subscribe to Tampa Bay Activist Network on YouTube, so that way you can stay up with City Council Watch and other videos pertaining to local politics and calls to action. Tomorrow there's a community rally at 12:30 p.m. at the Hillsborough County 13th Judicial Court, where State Attorney Andrew Warren is, in solidarity for Jamie Bullock, community member who's facing potential felony charges out of protest from July 4th last year. So if you can make it, that'd be great. And also sign up for public comment for City Council. It is the first of 2 budget hearings for September. Watch City Council Watch's latest call to action to learn more about some script ideas and budget ideas, and spread the word with your neighbors to get them involved to talk to City Council tomorrow. They can go live tomorrow, or if you sign up today before 5 p.m., you can speak virtually. All right, bye everyone.